We're pleased to have with us today Gregory A. Raymond, Professor of Political Science at Boise State University. Mr. Raymond is well known to some members of our faculty here at Brigham Young University. He has collaborated in the past with Dr. Earl Fry and Dr. David E. Bone in the publication of a book entitled The Other Western Europe, a comparative analysis of the smaller democracies. Mr. Raymond took his degree in political science, his bachelor's degree at Park College in Kansas City in 1968. He then pursued a master's degree and a PhD in international studies at the University of South Carolina. He has been involved in research and studies on alliance systems and the use of alliance systems in resolving international conflict. He is the author also of the following works: Third World Policies of Industrialized Nations, Conflict Resolution and the Structure of the State System, and he is the author of the forthcoming When Trust Breaks Down, Alliance Norms and World Politics. Dr. Raymond will address us today on the subject of U.S. anti-terrorism policy. If he has time, he will take questions, although he has a great deal to say to us this morning, but he will try to answer questions at the end if it's possible. Dr. Raymond.
Hey, thank you very much for the invitation to come here. I'd like to do one thing before I begin, and that's move these chairs, because if I don't, I guarantee you within 15 minutes I'll be Inspector Clouseau up here, stumbling about. So I'll just kind of give myself some room. Again, I'd like to thank the Kennedy Center for its gracious invitation. And what I'd like to do today is focus on the concept of terrorism and some of the problems that nation-states face when trying to confront this reality. To begin with, let me pose to you a very simple proposition. Imagine you live in the 1500s and you want to turn out all of the lights in a village that you see. How would you do it? You probably would have to go door to door and douse the candles that you saw. It would take you a long time. Now imagine it's 1987 and you want to turn out all the lights in a particular town that you happen to see. It's relatively simple. You find the right power lines or the right generator, you have an explosive, and suddenly turns out all the lights in the town. Okay, that difference between trying to turn out the lights in 1500 versus the lights in 1987 illustrates something important about terrorism today. And that is, we live in a very complex society, and that complexity creates vulnerabilities. Given the modern weapon systems that are at the disposal of any potential terrorist, and given the complexity of society and the numerous potential targets, it's relatively easy today for a small group of individuals to have a large impact on our public consciousness. Now let me begin with the concept of terrorism, because one of the most frequently cited maxims for those who talk about terrorism is that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And the problem with that is it overlooks the very nature of what terror involves. What I've put up here is a basic typology of forms of terror. And I've drawn it in such a way that only the people in the front row can see it. Let's begin with the concept of terror. Terror is a subjective phenomenon. It's the creation of fear and alarm in a human being. And when we talk about terror, the first thing we can do is distinguish between two forms. One we could call epiphenomenal, and the other systematic. The systematic version is the kind we're interested in. Epiphenomenal terror is the kind of fear and alarm that you might experience, for example, if a massive earthquake suddenly hit this region. We would be terrorized if this building began to shake and pieces of the ceiling began to come down. There are numerous instances where human beings have experienced terror that is this form of epiphenomenal terror due to natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, and so forth. That's not what we're interested in when we talk about terrorism, though. What we're interested in is systematic terror. That is terror that's purposefully engineered by individuals to create fear and alarm in others. Now, when we talk about systematic terror, this purposefully engineered fear and alarm, we can distinguish between two broad types, non-political and political. Non-political terror can be of several forms. First of all, there are individuals who, for pathological reasons, may try to create fear and alarm in others. Not necessarily political reasons, but strange, idiosyncratic, pathological reasons. For example, think of the Tylenol killer. Here there seems to be no political purpose in mind, but rather some strange psychological problem that an individual had. Secondly, there is another form of non-political terror, hedonistic terror. There are reports from time to time of, for example, in New York City, subway gangs who roam the cars of various subways and terrorize the passengers. Again, they have no political motive for this, but rather they seem, as they say, to do it because it's fun. It's a hedonistic form of behavior. And the third kind of non-political terror is criminal terror, that there are numerous instances of individuals who create fear and alarm for their personal economic gain, not to create any political change in society. One thinks of, for example, the Godfather film, Don Corleone, who used terror against various individuals, again for economic purposes. So when we talk about systematic terrorism, we have to move aside the various non-political forms of terror, where clearly there's fear and alarm created among individuals, but not for political purposes. Political terrorism is the use of fear and alarm to create an environment of intimidation or extortion for political purposes. And here we have two basic forms. One, throughout history there have been numerous instances in which terror has been used to repress a given population. A government may use terror to keep a population under control. One thinks, for example, of the Stalinist purges as an example of this kind of government repression, or the regime of General Field Marshal Idi Amin Dada as another example, or the regime of Pol Pot in Kampuchea, or the military government in Argentina, which brought us the disappeared ones. All of these are instances of terror by a government to repress a given population. Our interest is political terror of a different sort. That is the use of terror in order to produce change, revolt, to break the status quo. And if we look at the United States and its foreign policy with regard to terrorism, this is the form that, at least in the eyes of the Reagan administration, is the most dangerous and the kind that needs to be dealt with. That is to say, systematic political terror designed to change the status quo, to revolt from a given situation. And more often than that these days, we seem to represent the status quo, and terrorists see us as a legitimate target in order to change that status quo. Now, terrorism is used for a variety of reasons. What I've done is list sort of the 10 most common objectives that are mentioned by individual terrorists who have either surrendered or been captured. And when interviewed, why are you doing this? They often give a very lengthy story explaining the rationale behind their behavior. And if we summarize all of the things that have been said, we get about 10 basic objectives. Clearly, some groups may engage in terrorism only for a few of these, and most groups probably don't try to do all 10 of these, but these are a basic checklist of objectives. First of all, terror is used in order to create a feeling of helplessness in society, to disorient individuals. If you are terrorized, you have the feeling that there's no one who can protect you, and that no one is, implicitly, the government in power. One way to discredit a government is to create in the population a feeling that there's no one that can help you. You're totally alone and isolated. A second objective of terrorism is to inflate the perceived power of the group. Most terrorist groups are relatively small, but yet we have the image of them as being very large and powerful. The Baader-Meinhof Gang in Germany, for example, public opinion polls in West Germany indicated that most Germans assumed that the Baader-Meinhof Gang was somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere from 3 to 10 times larger than it really was. Because the group was able to strike at a variety of locations throughout Germany, it led to the impression that they're everywhere. There must be a lot of them. And this is what a group wants to communicate to you. We're not just a few people on the fringes of society, but we are the wave of the future. There are many of us out there, and we will overwhelm you at some point. A third rationale for terrorism is to provoke the regime, to make the regime respond with brute force. One of the classic objectives of terror is to get the government to overreact, to get the government so frustrated that it's going to respond with all of its might against the group. And in so doing, it will take steps that perhaps will alienate the general population. That if you create large sweeps through neighborhoods, random checks of all individuals, dragnets, suspend civil liberties, and so forth, suddenly other individuals in society are going to feel the discomfort of this government response. And they then may begin to think that this government is a repressive one and ought not be supported. Closely associated with this is number 4, eroding the legitimacy of the regime. If I, as a terrorist, can get the government to overreact and take repressive measures that affect a lot of people, then the legitimacy of the government suddenly comes into question. People begin to ask, is this the type of society that I want to live in? Which plays exactly into my hands if I'm the one engineering this act of terror. In addition, there are some other side benefits. Publicity. That engaging in terrorism is news. It will be covered prime time. In fact, what I want to do is initiate my actions in the right place, at the right time, so it gets the maximum amount of coverage. The greater the publicity I get, the more attention my cause receives. My cause may be rather odd. People normally might not pay much attention to what I have to say. But if it's on prime time, it catches the attention. It's newsworthy. And so terror is great for grabbing publicity. In addition, it's very good for recruiting new members to the organization. I can portray myself at the forefront of the progressive movement of the world. I can show that I live a life of adventure, of danger, and I am fighting for some cause. And undoubtedly there will be people who will be attracted by that idea. If I'm fighting for the cause in a rather dull way, it's going to be hard to recruit new members. But if I can portray this as a life on the edge of adventure, undoubtedly I will get new members. In addition, terror can be used to maintain discipline in an organization. That once you engage with others in one of these acts, there is what some writers call a bond of blood that's created, where individuals now become more cohesive, having engaged in that common enterprise than they were before. Also, terrorism can be used to win concessions from a government. For example, there may be individuals who I want released from prison. By engaging in terrorism, it's far more likely I'll be able to get them released than if I simply engage in letters to the editor or more normal forms of political participation. In addition, I may be able to eliminate key individuals. There may be key figures in the government and power who stand in the way of what this group is trying to achieve. And one way to get them out of the way is through the use of terror against those individuals. And finally, the acquisition of resources. I need funds. I'm not an ordinary criminal. That would be called bank robbery. I'm expropriating funds from the capitalists. I'm doing it for revolutionary purposes. Terror gives me an opportunity to acquire the resources that I need in order to conduct and continue my struggle. So in summary, what we can say about political terrorism is that it has a variety of objectives, ranging from the very, very obvious things to more side benefits that may come into play. And regardless of whether we're talking about groups on the left or groups on the right, there seems to be consensus that these are the kinds of things that they want to achieve by use of political terrorism. Now, what's interesting about terrorist groups is that they have changed quite a bit in the last decade or so. Before you, I have sent around two handouts, and I'd like to refer to those to explain some of the structural changes that have occurred in terrorism between the 60s, when terrorism first became more pronounced, and the 80s, where we are now. The first handout places terrorism in the context of different forms of insurgency. We can compare different strategies of insurgency according to two dimensions. One, who is the leading force in the revolutionary movement? Is it the mass of society, or is it a small vanguard within society? Secondly, we can differentiate strategies according to the locus of action. Is the revolution to take place in the countryside, or does it take place in the city? So if we take those two dimensions and combine them, we get four basic strategies of insurgency. Terrorism represents one of those strategies. Basically, the belief that a small conspiratorial group, generally operating in urban areas, can bring about revolution. The roots of this belief can be traced back to the 19th century, when a variety of anarchist writers, such as Karl Heinzen, Bakunin, Nechayev, Morozov, Johann Most, all argued that a small conspiratorial group with the right weapon, in those days it was dynamite, could bring about vast change. The masses, they argued, were inert. Politically, they'd never do anything. They needed a small group to get them in motion. And terror would be the engine that starts the masses down the road to change. Now, in comparison to these 19th century terrorists, there were a variety of strategists who argued that this was a ludicrous idea. For example, classical Marxists believed that revolutions are not made by conspirators. In fact, both Engels and Marx wrote letters about a number of terrorist groups in Europe, most notably in Northern Ireland, in which they said these people are stupid fanatics. They don't understand the laws of history. Maoists, another insurgent strategy, tend to argue later on that terrorism at best has limited value. Its value is to intimidate a few key people, but basically revolutions are won by protracted rural guerrilla warfare. Castro and the theorists of the Cuban Revolution also see terrorism as having minimal value as an insurgent strategy. At best, it's used for diversion, but the real action takes place among, again, guerrillas in the countryside. So if we look at four basic insurgent strategies, the 19th century anarchist movement, classical Marxism, Maoism, and Castroism, what we find is three of the four arguing that terrorism at best has minimal value. Only the 19th century anarchists put much stock in terrorism as a real political movement. What happens in the 1960s, after the failure of revolutions throughout the Third World using Maoist and Castroid ideas, is the reemergence of this idea born in the 19th century. A small conspiratorial group using terror can start the revolutionary process in motion. If we look at the Tupamaros in Uruguay, the Baader-Meinhof Gang in Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy, the Angry Brigade in England, all of these groups share the fundamental assumptions of the 19th century anarchists. Small conspiratorial group with the right weaponry can bring down a powerful regime. Now, what's interesting about the emergence of this idea in the 60s, or I should say the reemergence because it was popular in the 19th century, is that most of the groups were self-sufficient, autonomous, homegrown organizations with local agendas. A study by Ted Gurr, the University of Colorado, examined 335 terrorist groups that operated during the 1960s. He found out of 335, only 19 that had any outside aid. And his conclusion was terrorist groups are all by and large small and self-sufficient, autonomous, homegrown, and operating on their own local agendas. That's the 1960s. That's the reemergence of that old anarchist idea of the 19th century. In the 1970s and 80s, however, something changes. That something is the groups become less and less autonomous, self-sufficient, with no outside support. By the 1980s, CI estimates indicate that over 25% of the operating groups have clear linkages to outside forces. Now, the second handout that I passed around gives you some sense of what this means for anyone who lives in the United States. At the top of the page is a graph. It shows you from 1968 through 1982 the trend in terrorist incidents. And the trend is real clear. The amount of terrorism escalates rather consistently throughout the 70s and into the 1980s. So the first conclusion we draw is that terrorism is more pronounced as we move closer to the present and away from the 1960s that Gurr had studied. Second is a pie chart. It shows you where most terrorism incidents occur. And throughout the globe, we find basically three locations that account for most terrorism: Latin America, Western Europe, and the Middle East. At the bottom of the page, we have a bar graph. It tells us who are the victims. Now remember the geographic location: Latin America, Western Europe, the Middle East. The bottom graph tells us who are the victims. By and large, overwhelmingly, the victims are North American. And more particular, the victims are from the United States. So what we see then is a change in the form of terrorism in the 70s and into the 80s from what Gurr had discovered in the 60s. Gurr had discovered these small, autonomous groups operating with local agendas in the 1960s, basically resurrecting the ideas of the 19th century anarchists. In the 70s and into the 80s, what we see is the emergence now of international linkages between groups, state support for various groups, coordinated and joint operations between different groups, something that was unforeseen in the 1960s. Let me give a few examples. In 1973, a Japanese 747 was hijacked on a flight from Amsterdam to Tokyo. The terrorists were a combined group of Japanese and Arab individuals. In 1973, this was rather rare, that two separate groups would be doing a coordinated act. In 1974, the Japanese Red Army attacked the French embassy in The Hague. Simultaneously, an individual known as Carlos the Jackal from Venezuela led a group of Arab commandos against a nightclub known as Le Drugstore in Paris. Simultaneous operation. Again, something that had never been seen before. A year later, in 1975, there was a raid on OPEC headquarters in Vienna. Arabs, Germans, and Venezuelans participated in that. So we start to see now, as terrorism in the 70s takes on almost a multinational character. You could have an operation that takes place in Paris, conducted by Japanese, Arabs, and Germans, armed with Czechoslovakian-made weapons, supplied by Libya, and in which their identity cards and so forth were forged in Belgium. Totally different from what Gurr had discovered in the 1960s. In addition, we start to see in the 70s state support for various groups. financial support, training, supplies, and organizational support. And the evidence is very clear. For example, in 1973, the British Navy intercepted a ship, the SS Claudia, in which they found 5 tons of Soviet-made weapons being shipped from Libya to the Irish Republican Army for their use. In 1975, there was a car crash in Belgium. The individual in the car was a KGB officer. Since he was disabled by the crash, the investigators took the liberty of looking around the car, in which they found a variety of documents indicating clear Soviet support for terrorist groups operating in Italy, Germany, and Belgium. In other words, terror suddenly now in the 70s gets far greater support from outside states than it ever did before. And thus it's differentiated from what was taking place in the 19th century as well as in the 1960s. Terror suddenly becomes a continuation of foreign policy by other means. Clearly illustrated in 1983 when a group of North Korean commandos set off a bomb in Burma, killing 17 visiting South Korean dignitaries. So in short, we see a major change. Terrorism is embraced by certain states as a new tool of foreign policy. And the reasons are quite simple why that would be done. Terrorism is a force multiplier. If you are a relatively small state and have a relatively active idea of what your foreign policy should be on the world stage, here is a low-cost, low-risk way of making your presence felt. It's a tactical tool. Exploit local grievances and use these groups to project your power into a region. First, as I said, there's low risk of escalation. Terrorism, by its very nature, is clandestine. It's secret. You can deny that you're in any way involved in this action. So if I'm the head of a relatively small government and I want to put pressure on another state, I can send a group of commandos out, and even if they're caught, I can claim I know nothing about it. These are not my troops. These are simply a motley crew of deranged individuals that I have nothing to do with. So it's unlikely someone is going to retaliate against me because I have plausible denial. Secondly, it's incredibly inexpensive. If I want to make my military might felt and build up a conventional army, it's going to cost me an awful lot. But if I want to make my might felt through terrorism, it's very inexpensive. But clearly it will catch the attention of the targets that I'm sending these terrorists out against. Furthermore, there is the prospect of great political return, of great yield. Think, for example, of how much impact the taking of hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Iran had on the Carter administration. An enormous impact. Think of the impact that the killing of the Marines in Beirut, Lebanon had on the Reagan administration. Despite all of the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan, we quickly pulled our troops out of that region. Tremendous yield for little cost. 1 truck and 1 bomb and an individual to drive the truck. If someone wanted to drive the Marines out through conventional arms, it would have been far more difficult. And finally, it's unlikely that anyone will ever retaliate against me. For example, even if you suspect I'm behind a terrorist act, there may be diplomats or businessmen from your country still in my country. If you launch a raid on me, you have to calculate what will I do to these nationals inside of my country. Secondly, can you really count on your allies? They may be doing brisk business with my country. Would your allies really join you to try and put sanctions on me? Would they cut their own economic throats? Perhaps not. And finally, how will your domestic public react? Democracies, by and large, are not very sympathetic to covert actions. So if you try to use the CIA or any other covert organization against me, sooner or later that will be leaked out, and there may be an uproar about this type of activity. So by and large, terrorism makes a lot of sense to to a relatively small country that wants to extend its influence on the world scene in today's international environment. And as a result, when the Reagan administration came into power on the heels of the Iran crisis, it promised that it was going to do something about this problem. Ronald Reagan promised, quote, swift and effective retribution. Secretary of State Alexander Haig claimed that the Reagan administration would do as much to suppress terrorism as the Carter administration had done to promote human rights. But the bottom line was, from the time that Ronald Reagan took over until 1983, when the Marines were bombed in Beirut, it was all rhetoric. The great communicator talked, but there was little action to back up what was going on. In the wake of the bombing in 1983, suddenly the administration unleashes a crash program to try and upgrade security at embassies abroad, at military bases abroad, and at the White House itself. Secretary of State Schultz, at that point, begins a campaign to put together a policy to deal with terrorism that is more than pure rhetoric. His argument can be summarized as follows. Terrorism, he says, is an act of war. The United States cannot be hamstrung by indecisiveness. It must be willing to use force when needed to counter terrorism. However, the Reagan administration was divided. At the very time that Schultz was speaking out in favor of using force against terrorists, the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, was saying privately, and sometimes publicly, that he wasn't sure that this was the answer. As he put it, fighting terrorism with the military can be a messy business. It can tarnish reputations, destroy careers, if we get involved in a quagmire situation. He went on to say that he would support using military force only in very clear-cut, well-defined situations. And his argument concluded by saying most terrorist incidents do not involve clear-cut, well-defined situations in terms of who did it, when they did it, and who supported it. Nevertheless, the administration reached a conclusion. On April 3rd, 1984, Ronald Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 138, which basically stated, 1, every country has the right of self-defense. 2, state-supported terrorism represents an act of war. 3, those states that support terrorism, therefore, will suffer the consequences of U.S. military retaliation. On July 8th, in 1985, Reagan gave another speech devoted to the problem of terrorism, in which he warned those countries which he believed were supporting the bulk of international terrorism. He said, quote, outlaw states run by misfits and Looney Tunes, unquote, will be retaliated against. And specifically he named Iran, Cuba, Libya, Nicaragua, and North Korea. He called for what is known as a proactive policy with 3 components. Component 1, reprisals. If someone takes an act of terrorism aimed at the United States, we would retaliate for that illegal act and punish the perpetrator. Under international law, retaliation in a reprisal is legal. If someone takes an illegal act against you, and if there is no peaceful way of solving the dispute, it is quite appropriate under international law to retaliate, so long as you do so in proportion to the attack launched against you, you don't injure any innocent third parties, and once you've retaliated, you cut off the attack. Secondly, a proactive policy was to involve preemption. A preemptive attack is when you have some knowledge that a group is organizing some future action against you. Rather than waiting for it, you attack first against that group. You preempt them. Now, from the point of view of the Reagan administration, this was better than reprisals. If you can preempt an attack, rather than launch a retaliation against it, it's much better because you haven't suffered the damage from that group's activity. But most observers came to one conclusion about this. It was unlikely that the administration had the wherewithal to launch effective preemptive attacks. Preemption requires intelligence, and most notably what's called human intelligence. We are great at using national technical means of gathering intelligence. Satellites with cameras, electronic eavesdropping, and so forth. We are very poor in human intelligence, agents in the field gathering information. In order to launch a preemptive attack, you've got to know what this group is up to. Terrorist groups, by their nature, are small, secretive, closed groups. They're hard to infiltrate. Given we had few human intelligence assets, and given the difficulty of the target, most observers concluded that preemptive attacks were whistling in the dark. They would be great, but we lacked the intelligence to be effective in such attacks. The third leg of proactive policy was retribution. Retribution is best illustrated by the actions of Israel after the 1972 Munich Olympics, when a group of Israeli athletes were murdered. Prime Minister Golda Meir created a group of Israeli commandos known as the Wrath of God and charged them with the task of hunting down each one of the terrorists who was at Munich and killing that terrorist. The policy backfired when the Israeli commandos mistakenly killed an individual who had nothing to do with the Munich enterprise. And as a result, the third leg of proaction, retribution, sometimes runs into some very sticky moral, ethical, and political dilemmas. Would the American public support the creation of a kind of Wrath of God unit to scour the world to uncover individuals who had perpetrated these deeds and send them on their way? Would the American public support it if the group from time to time made mistakes? So, in summary, if we look at the Reagan response of proactive policy, what we see is that reprisals are after the fact and do not seem to be something that can stop terrorism in the near future. Preemption, which would be much better at that, we are not very well equipped to do. Retribution is highly controversial. So we're left with a problem. Terrorism still exists. It's still very difficult to stop. And what do we know about stopping it? Well, clearly we know one thing. Let's draw an analogy between terrorism on the one hand and piracy on the other. In previous years, pirates were a real difficult problem for any maritime nation. And it was only after pirates were made universal criminals, punishable by any nation, without regard to nationality, without regard to location of the crime, that piracy was brought under control. Most observers conclude that it would take the same kind of environment to bring terrorism under control. But so long as the international system is as divided as it is, it's unlikely that we would get terrorists defined as universal criminals, regardless of nationality or location of the crime. So therefore, we fall back upon what can we as a nation-state do, assuming we can't get universal support from the entire international community. What do we know about what breeds success and what doesn't work in stopping terrorism? By and large, anti-terrorist policies can be divided into two types. Those which have actions aimed at the terrorists themselves, and those that have actions aimed at the supporters of terrorists. In dealing with terrorists themselves, the biggest issue that's debated is the issue of negotiation. should you talk and negotiate with terrorists? Should you give concessions when terrorists make demands? On the one hand, there are those who argue that our policy should never be to give concessions, because that only encourages further actions by terrorists. On the other hand, there are those who say when lives are at stake, we should always negotiate. So where do we stand? Which way should we come down on the issue? Studies done of terrorist incidents indicate the following: that even states that claim they don't negotiate in reality do. They may not make concessions, but they talk. What seems to work in a terrorist episode is to talk and prolong the episode. And in prolonging the episode, then the psychological balance in the situation begins to shift away from the terrorist and over to you. So the best policy seems to be one in which you talk, but you don't offer serious concessions. A spin-off of this is whether or not it's useful to declare truces and ceasefires. Again, what we find is that by and large, truces and ceasefires with terrorists do not work. In the short run, it stops some violence. In the long run, statistically we see that the level of violence increases after a truce or ceasefire. One, the terrorist group has had an opportunity to rearm, and two, by dealing with the group, by negotiating with the group, you've given the group legitimacy in the eyes of many individuals. Now, what can we say about actions aimed at the supporters of terrorists? One of the most common pieces of conventional wisdom is what you need to do is improve the conditions that give rise to individuals who turn to terrorism. Make economic reforms, and that will solve the problem. It sounds plausible, but statistically, again, we find something very interesting in the data. And that is, very often, terrorism is linked to good economic times. Terrorists do not always come from countries suffering from deprivation, unemployment, and inflation. But they often emerge from societies that are doing well economically. One thinks of the Red Brigades in Italy, the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany, the Japanese Red Army. All are cases of societies that are doing well rather than terribly. In addition, it's argued, it's necessary to make political reforms besides economic reforms. But once again, we find that after reforms are made and a time lag passes, terrorism seems to pop up once again. Finally, it could be argued that perhaps the best way to solve it is through some form of collective punishment. But once again, what we find is collective punishment against the larger society that may harbor terrorists falls directly into one of the objectives that terrorists want to pursue: provoking the regime to use brute force. So to summarize, what do we know about terrorism? What we know is that it's changed its form in the 70s and 80s. And as it's changed its form, it has taken on much more outside state support, thus making it far more lethal than ever before. Homegrown terrorists are not as well armed, not as well financed and supported as state-supported groups. So the nature of terrorism has changed radically in the 70s and the 80s. And by and large, the United States has been divided on what to do about it. The ideas about what we can do seem to be that we lack many of the resources in the area of intelligence that it would take to launch an effective preemptive policy. And for that reason, we often find ourselves retaliating after the fact rather than being able to deter or prevent before such an action takes place. Retaliation after the fact, however, is, as Caspar Weinberger put it, a messy business. and thus often leads to some violent debates within the administration as to what else can be done. And seemingly, we are hamstrung by this particular question. Let me stop at this point. There are just a few minutes if there are any questions that anyone would like to address.
How effective do you think the Libyan raid was?
Well, there are two ways of looking at that. It's sort of a situation in which the raid occurs, and then suddenly there doesn't seem to be as much Libyan activity in the aftermath of that raid. So we're left with these two alternatives. One plausible way of interpreting what happened is the raid worked. Gaddafi was shown that if he supports these groups, we will retaliate against him, and therefore that deterred future support. A second alternative that some people have suggested is that in reality, Gaddafi had nothing on the drawing boards, and that the raid, therefore, really had nothing to do with his calculations. If I had to come down personally on this, my own feelings about the raid were not of strong support. I thought it was trying to use a sledgehammer in order to get a mosquito. But on the other hand, as I look back on it, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of Libyan activity at the moment. And so I suspect it probably had a sobering impact on Mr. Gaddafi. But I guarantee you that from the psychological point of view, I have a very difficult time being able to probe his underlying motives and incentives. And so therefore it's a hunch on my part. So I would say that initially I was not real supportive of the raid, but in retrospect there seems to be at least some plausibility to a deterrent factor that came out of it. Yes?
Why haven't terrorists been more active on American soil?
That's an interesting proposition, and it would seem to me that if a group wanted to escalate activity in the future, that would be the next step, to come into the United States. And we certainly were afraid of that in the middle of the Reagan administration. We started putting barriers around the White House and so forth, and there was rumors of the Libyan hit team that they were floating around Canada somewhere, and they were going to drop down across the border. Clearly, anyone who would want to launch such a terrorist action against the United States would find it relatively easy. People can get across our borders without any difficulty. I can get almost anything across our border if I had the right contacts in Colombia or Venezuela, and I could ship it through Florida along with the various drugs they get across our border. So the opportunity is there. Why haven't they operated here then? And there, it's a very difficult thing to answer. One plausible possibility is that it's much easier to operate in other societies where you have greater familiarity and where you have ample targets. The United States has numerous people abroad, businessmen, tourists, diplomats. There are more targets than a terrorist could possibly exhaust. And so therefore, why risk a relatively more difficult enterprise of coming all the way to the United States to operate when you can do it overseas in Europe or Latin America or the Middle East to a lesser extent? So it seems to be the opportunity is open, no question about it. But there seems to be still an easy time doing it overseas, and that probably accounts for it. Yes? Last question.
Do you have any prescriptions?
Do I have any prescriptions? I think if you seriously want to do something about terrorism, the best means is not retaliation. The Israelis have been retaliating for years against terrorist raids, and what we see is it hasn't stopped it. That often retaliation is met with counteraction. So I would argue that if we really want to do something about it, the kinds of raids on Libya in the long term don't offer a lot of hope. That in the long term, the best thing is preemption. But we are inadequately armed, so to speak, to engage in preemptive acts. So therefore, what I would suggest, if we want to deal with terrorism, we need to build up the human intelligence assets that we need in order to be effective in that area. But frankly, given the escapades of Irangate, I don't think that you will find an administration coming into power after the next election that will be very sympathetic to pumping a lot of activity and funding and training and so forth into that particular area. We are again now, after Irangate, somewhat concerned about the CIA and other covert agencies acting as rogue elephants, as we were back in the 1970s. So therefore, my guess is we will step back from human intelligence, and in so doing, that will prevent us from being very effective in launching any preemptive actions against terrorist groups.